Hello, it's Todd Lewis here from Mainline Automotive Equipment, and the purpose of this video today is just to show you how to put some basic vehicle details in and why some of them details are used throughout the program. So we'll start by doing what's called setting up a new test header, which is the shortcut is Control E. On this prompt here, which is do you want to clear test ID, test comments, vehicle data, customer data, we choose yes to this prompt, and all that does is just clear out, if a previous vehicle's been tested, it just clears them details out of the system so we can fill in a new test header. So think of a test header as a blank form you're filling out, and these details will get applied each consecutive run you do to generate run files. So in here, the test ID, it's used to be a brief description of each individual test you do, or it's the same name if you're doing multiple tests, but it is recommended on a test by test basis to possibly change the test ID so you can differentiate between what test you're doing. So try not to leave it at the word baseline test, otherwise you'll have every test in your system as baseline test. So we'll just give it a test ID here today, call like a training test. The next very important thing to do on a new test header is to set the data path, and this is where you're going to save any ramp test files you want to do on this vehicle. So we'll set the data path. The Dyno log directory is the base Dyno folder, and there's a whole series of preset folders that we install when we set up a dyno, and you can add to these files. So today what we'll do, we'll click on Holden, we'll go to V8 Commodore, and I've made a subfolder here already called VE, but just to show you, to make a new folder, you might want to make a folder up specifically for the registration of the car, so you can structurally set up where you want to save runs. So we'll just put in some details of this particular vehicle. That's just the registration plate number I've used there. We go OK and OK again. So this is where our data path, any runs we do on this vehicle, it's going to get saved into that folder. Everything else on this header, on this tab here, you don't have to worry about. The Dyno program will apply the date and time when the test is done, and it'll assign an ever-increasing test number to the actual as you use the program. You can type a test comment in here now, but typically you do that after you start doing tests. So the next tab we go to is the vehicle tab. Now, everything in this tab here is predominantly optional, but you can't close this window down without putting in a rego number, which is essentially a license plate number. So I'll just put in the rego of this car we're going to test. This box here, that's the only place in the program it automatically defaults to caps lock, so you don't have to worry about putting caps lock here, it'll do it automatically for you. So the rego, like I said, it's like a license plate number. But if it's a drag car or a race car, something like that, you can just put any, like a race number or something in there, just to give it a name, just to keep the program happy. The next thing you do, very important in a hub dyno, is to fill in this engine to actual RPM field. It's a field, it's looking at the total ratio from the engine RPM to the actual RPM. So in the case of this car, we're going to, an example is a manual vehicle which we test in 1-to-1 gear, for example. So if the drift ratio is 3.5, we'll just type that in. So that just tells the software that the overall ratio from the engine RPM to the axle is 3.45 to 1. There is another field down the bottom right hand corner here, which is a bit confusing because it says final drive ratio, but it's currently not a used field, so don't fill that one in there, just leave that. Very important just to fill in the engine to actual RPM field. And then a couple other things on the default header, I just changed the number of cylinders. You can click on a firing order if you want to, and I typically put in the volume of the engine. We can change from litres to cubic inch in channel properties, which we'll show in another video. And everything else here is optional, but I'll just put in a brief description of the vehicle. Don't get too stressed if you forget to fill out fields here. They can all be edited after you start doing tests, and you can edit them in 2 years' time, for example. So as long as you put some basic details in, these will be applied as you start using ramp tests. On the customer tab, I don't get too involved. You can put as much customer details in as you want, but we'll just put a basic name in. On the gearing tab, all you really have to worry about here is I just put in the gear I'm going to do the test in, and all that does is just provides an on-screen indication in the ramp test screen as to what gear you should be in when you're doing the test. So if you happen to pull a run file in to use as a template later on, that number will be on the screen to remind you what gear to do the test in. So a lot of this other stuff down here is for motorbike dyno, for where you can do some gearing analysis. So, but for just the sake of the hub dyno test, we just put that in there, still if it's an auto or not. None of this does anything as far as how the dyno operates. They're just purely details you're putting in about the vehicle. So once we're happy with that, we can just click save. And to quickly show you what that overall gear ratio number does, if you see here on this screen, this speed gauge here, it's actual RPM. And if you notice here, there's a yellow needle, which is called the demand needle. And the operator can press page up or page down to move that around to hold the car at whatever actual speed they want. But if I went to 1,000 actual RPM, as shown here, the equivalent engine RPM would be 3450 RPM. So that's how that number becomes very important. So if we wanted to pull the car down to somewhere close to 2,000 RPM and hold it there, I can use a series of keyboard shortcuts to hold it at that particular RPM based off this axle speed. So that's the first place that that number is used. It's very handy for you. The next screen, when we go to the ramp test screen, you may see some numbers down the bottom of the screen. These are actual RPM numbers, and these are theoretical engine RPM numbers. So when we go to set up a test, we click on setup, you'll notice that if I click on, say, 600 axle RPM for the start speed, the equivalent engine speed is going to be 2070 RPM. And if I go to, for example, 1850 axle RPM, the equivalent engine speed is going to be 6,380. So by inputting that number, it immediately saves you not having to know what axle speed you have to use to start using the hub dyno. So it's very important. So here we're going to go roughly from 2,000 to 6,400 or thereabouts when we do a test. So that's just showing you what that derived RPM figure does there. Now we'll click OK. So now you can see here on the bottom of the screen, we're going to start the test about 600 axle RPM, 2,070 engine RPM, all out here to 1850 axle RPM, or about 6,400 engine RPM. So if you get these numbers at the top of the screen, that's just some dummy data I was mucking around with.